Right, thank you very much for the introduction and the revelations about my name. Indeed, my name is Bram Sizoo, as most people say Sizoo. There's only the odd one out who calls me Schizo, and that's very interesting. I'm very grateful for this invitation, and Martien, we met earlier on in the Netherlands, and you asked me to come and give a presentation here, which I'm very honored to do. Perhaps it's good to first of all explain to you where I work. I'm a psychiatrist, and I work in an institute for mental health in the east of the Netherlands. And due to the larger scale of operations, we've got the ability to actually concentrate activities on developmental disorders in a center for developmental disorders in Deventer, which gives many opportunities for further research. This morning I'd like to discuss a number of things. First of all, I'd like to talk about autism, and I'd like to explain about the timeline of autism, emphasizing the fact that we're talking about a developmental disorder. Then I would like to discuss with you whether there are such things as core symptoms of autism. And then, after having dealt with autism, we will explore how autism and attachment meet, what sort of fields. I will briefly review the literature and then look at the consequences and finally draw conclusions. So autism, the concept of autism is changing, and autism is a developmental disorder. So it's a disorder in the development rather than a childhood disorder, which is confined to childhood, as was long believed to be the case. Autism is not just something which is very clear, it's changing. It's not just changing over time within one person, it also changes, or it's also very different, heterogeneous amongst persons. So when we talk about autism or autism spectrum disorders, it's good to think about what are we actually thinking about, what are we actually talking about when we discuss autism as a concept. The environment has got a large contribution to how autism manifests itself, and so does age. In autism, within a person with autism, there's normal development along certain lines, for example, cognitive capabilities, next to the arrested social-emotional abilities. So, for example, in clinical practice, in our clinic, we have a person with an IQ of 140, but with a social-emotional level of a child of 5. And that's remarkable, and it's striking, and it's very much invalidating to this person. Traditionally, autism focuses on 3 domains. So there have to be problems in the reciprocal social interaction, and the emphasis on the word reciprocity. There have to be problems in verbal or non-verbal language, and there could also be problems with stereotype behavior and restricted patterns of interests. Now, these all vary in intensity amongst people and also within people over time. So actually what you see is that you get a sort of changing phenotype, which makes it very difficult to classify and very difficult to treat if you don't look carefully. So autism, as being a classification of symptoms, tells us basically what we see, not what autism is. So the classification, autism spectrum disorder, as we know it from DSM-4, DSM-5, is basically what we see is the mask we look at. It doesn't tell us anything about what goes on behind the mask. Just a short history on autism. John Watkins in 1943, Leo Kanner described a number of children with what he called autistic disturbances of the affective contact. Now, Kanner was a very keen and observing clinician, and what he noticed by just observing was that there was a biological predisposition, as he assumed, for a limited psychological attunement to the social world these children lived in. The second main domain he identified were communication problems and also resistance to change. So you see that in 1943, without any techniques, without any neuropsychological data, just purely by observing, he already identified the three domains which we traditionally regard as belong to autism. Now, Kanner emphasized the developmental perspective, that autism is not a static thing, it's not like a broken leg which you have or you do not have. There's a developmental perspective you have to take into account. And it lasted until 1978, until, for the first time, Sir Michael Rutter brought forward a clear definition of autism spectrum disorder. Now, meanwhile, in 1943, remember Kanner was 1943, and sorry, in 1944 in Vienna, Hans Asperger described a number of children with similar features. And he also was a very keen clinician, and he noticed also problems in communication, problems in social interaction, and problems in stereotype behavior. And he published a paper in 1944 which went largely unnoticed. Perhaps it was the time frame which made it not so popular in the scientific world to read German papers, unfortunately, because it lasted until 1990 before Lorna Wing, a famous researcher on autism, rediscovered his paper and noticed that the features that Hans Asperger described in 1944 were remarkably similar to the features described by Leo Kanner in 1943. And that is when the discussion started. Is the Asperger disorder, is it similar to autism? Now that discussion has gone on for a long time, and perhaps you know that in DSM-5 the discussion has been ended because now we do not distinguish anymore between autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, abbreviated BDD-NOS, horrible abbreviation for people with autism, but we just typified as a sort of enveloping concept, autism spectrum disorders. Okay, the classification in time, in DSM-3 there was a classification, then it moved on to, then it was still in DSM-3 revised on axis 2, and then it moved surprisingly to axis 1 in DSM-4. And you might wonder what was the reason for it to move from axis 2, where personality disorders are classified, to axis 1. Well, one anecdote is that at the time in the US, axis 2 disorders were not so favorable amongst the insurers. So axis 1 disorders were, so there was a strong lobby for autism, and let's move it on to axis 1. So the DSM-4, 5, 3 processes are not always rational. The autistic triad remained, and mainly thanks to the Campbell study which Wing and Gold conducted in 1979, the triad of reciprocal social interaction problems, communication problems, and restricted and repetitive behavior was considered to be three sides of one mask, so to say. And it was as one phenotype. And all research went into looking for the one cause, because that had to be obvious. If there was one phenotype, there had to be one cause. Now that research proved very difficult because there was a lot of discrepancy between the findings, and I won't go into too much detail because we haven't got time for that, but it was not until 2011 that it was indicated by, I'll remember her name a little bit later on, but she actually showed that the triad was fractionable, that the correlations between the three components of the triad were very low. Okay, the prevalence of autism in the population, it depends on the type of research, and it depends very much on what population you actually study. It also depends on what classification criteria you use, obviously. So what we see in history is that the prevalence figures have made a drastic rise up to an extent that people also ask me, it looks like an epidemic. Is autism not an epidemic? Well, fortunately, it's not an epidemic, but the prevalence figures have risen, and the recent figures are around 1%, and that's based on a study conducted by Bruha and colleagues in the United Kingdom. There's still a discrepancy between male and female diagnosis, like we know in ADHD, but the female population is catching up, so to say. Now, there's something to consider. If we look at the ratio between diagnosis between male and female, we see roughly 4 to 1 ratio. That means that we diagnose 4 times as many men with autism as we diagnose women with autism. Basically, that doesn't say anything about autism amongst men and women. It tells us something about how we diagnose autism. So it could well be that we're not looking properly at how autism manifests in females. And actually we're discovering slowly that indeed we are not looking properly, we're not looking at the right things. It's not very useful to ask young girls, are you very much interested in trains, or do you note airplane numbers? Because they don't. Some of them are. But they're very into horses, for example. So it's other things that catch their interest. Traditionally, we have focused on the technical details and said, well, if there are many of these technical interests, then there could be autism. So we have to change our understanding of autism. Our social class is not a determinant of autism, and immigration is. And it's still very puzzling how that works. Again, unfortunately, we haven't got time to go into this into detail, but I'm sure that the PDF will appear on the website, so you'll have all time to look at it yourselves. So the reasons for this increase in prevalence could be the broader definition of autism. It could be increased complexity of society. Now that's remarkable, but that has never been studied methodologically, whether this change in society, so the higher information density, is actually a contributing factor to the higher prevalence of autism. Medicalization, whereas in other cultures and earlier times, behavior was accepted as difficult behavior, but well, there you go, we'll have to deal with it. Nowadays, behavior is very much medicalized, unfortunately. And in doing so, we are also externalizing the behavior to the professional medical services, whereas we are forgetting that there's also a lot of resilience within families and within systems that we are probably not exploring. Fortunately, we're seeing a sort of counter movement which actually focuses on the natural resources within families. So demedicalization is a topic. I might be out of a job in some, but that doesn't matter. It's for the good of the population, that's okay. As long as it doesn't come too fast. Okay, there's also increased media attention for autism. Now that has a high impact. And there's a shift from a lesion to a proneness model. Now interestingly, this proneness model is studied most amongst schizophrenia. And the idea is that you are born with the proneness, with the vulnerability for developing a disorder. So in the metaphor of the broken leg, you're not born with the broken leg, but you've got very weak bones, so you are prone, you are liable, or it's possible that you might break a leg sooner than someone else. Now that has been put into a diagram which is slightly complicated, but I'll walk you through it. On the axis here, you see age, right? So a child is born and moves along life. And on the vertical axis, I hope I'm not standing in front, you can see. On the vertical axis, we see the expression of, in this case, schizophrenia symptoms. And you see 2 blue planes, one here and one there. And in between you see something like, it's like a mat. It's something which is flexible and it moves with a sort of waving motion through this figure in a three-dimensional aspect. And the idea is that an individual will move from here to there. You don't have to do much about that. You're growing older. As Frank commemorated, you do get older. I'm not 41, I'm 52. But anyway, I'm in right? So that's one factor. The other factor is the degree of risk you encounter in your life. If you grow up in a very riskful family, you're somewhere here on the figure, right? So that would make you, put you here on this little mat. If you're born in a warm and protected family, you're born here. And you acquire experiences of the environment as you go along in life. So it's possible for an individual to move like this, right? Fairly safe, no risk life. So it'll stay at this end of the map. It's also possible for someone to be born with a vulnerability for schizophrenia, for example, and to encounter problems, and first of all, he will cross this first blue plane, which will indicate that there are schizophrenia symptoms, but not enough to classify schizophrenia. And then, for example, in adolescence, the child will start experimenting with drugs and alcohol, and come across a peer group which lures the child or the adolescent into criminal behavior, and things escalate, and you see it pops up above the blue plane. Now, the good thing is that if you increase the protective factors, once someone has popped up as schizophrenic above the blue plane, and for example, you find medication which is appropriate, you find environmental factors which are appropriate, it is possible for the individual, for the final years of his or her life, to dip under the blue plane again. Now, it has got some face validity, of course, but the conceptual problem is, does someone, after having dipped under the blue plane, have schizophrenia or not? The insurers will, I teach doctors who work for insurance companies, they get extremely confused at this stage, because they say, well, how can you not have schizophrenia anymore? How can you not have autism anymore? And that's where the proneness model or the liability model comes into the picture. Because if you think of schizophrenia, autism, and ADHD, and in fact all psychopathology as a proneness too, then you can explain the proneness doesn't go away, the vulnerability doesn't go away, that doesn't change, but the environmental factors have changed to such an extent that this individual now does not manifest the symptoms as much as it did before. And that's good news. It means that we must not only look at the individual, so the traditional doctor-patient relationship in a closed room where doctor listens and thinks, right, I know what it is, and tells the patient, you have got this, you need to do that, leaves the consultation room again. That is old-fashioned. What we need to move towards, and certainly in psychiatry, in adult psychiatry, is that we must incorporate the family, the natural system, much more right from the beginning, to understand the problems in context. Right, that's a personal plea. Anyway, we'll move on. We're still dealing with autism. What causes autism? Well, there's also some misleading explanations for autism, unfortunately. And I don't know whether you remember Wakefield's paper in 1998, who claimed that autism was caused by the triple vaccine, and he had data to prove that. That caused a lot of, that it was a scare. And actually we saw that the vaccination figures dropped dramatically with consequences, and it did not, it wasn't until 2011 that in Britain the paper was published which indicated that actually the data on which Wakefield has based his paper was fraudulent. So the data was made up. Now we see more of these things in science, but especially for the community, of parents with children with autism, this was dramatic, of course. Okay, we move on to definitions of autism, because at the beginning I said it's very difficult to define autism just from one perspective. Now we can look at autism from different explanatory levels. First of all, we have the phenotype. So that's the mask we look at when we observe a person. We do not need to talk to the person. Unfortunately, some people do not talk to people with autism, they just look. But if you just look, you see the mask and you see observable behavior. And that's what we call the phenotype. Now the second level is the endophenotype. That is what goes on behind the mask, so to say. So it's the neuropsychological mechanisms. That's what we call the endophenotype. And then finally we've got the genotype, which is the hereditary, the genetic data with which we are born. And how do these three levels interact? Well, they interact by the environment. So the environment is literally the regulating factor on how the genetic material, the genetic information, is expressed into endophenotypical and phenotypical symptoms, and vice versa, because the genetic data is also influenced by the environment. I'll give you a short explanation later on. So let's look at the phenotypical level. And we look at DSM-5, which last month was launched at the conference in San Francisco of the American Psychiatric Association. And in DSM-5, we do not have 3 domains anymore, we've got 2 domains. Because the working party said, well, look, looking at communication problems in the second domain, looking at reciprocal social interaction in the first domain, basically communication is a social thing. Indeed it is. So they combined those two, and now we have 2 domains. So the first domain, in DSM-5, dealing with autism, said there have to be persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across contexts. This is where the word context comes into it. Not accounted for by general developmental delays. And the second domain is that there have to be restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests or activities, including hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input or unusual interests in sensory aspects of the environment. And we are very glad that this hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input has now been put into the classification model, because it was still considered to be fringe. But people with autism generally have a lot of problems with either understimulation or overstimulation, which can be very invalidating. So we are not altogether very sad about the changes in DSM-5. DSM-5 also emphasizes that there is a heterogeneous presentation, and we're dealing with the autism spectrum. As I said before, changes within the person and changes over time. And there's still very little knowledge about adults with autism, because until 10, 15 years ago, autism was still considered to be something of the children. The children grow up. And as they grow up, they do not suddenly, at their 18th birthday, get rid of their autism, unfortunately. Now, I'd like to show you a fragment of a film directed by Temple Grandin herself. And this is where this lady plays Temple Grandin, and where this lady explains what autism is to her. Perhaps we should turn off the light.
I know there are a lot of people that can't understand what's going on. My wife had a meeting.
I don't know that I want to hear from any of the experts.
If you will just let me finish. Will you please let me finish? With intensive psychotherapy, an autistic child can be
The
treated.
Ripley report clearly shows that autism is not a psychological problem.
I am not familiar with
Calm
the
down, calm down, calm down, sweetie. Sweetie, calm
It would
down.
be better if
Calm
you could
down.
get her to sit calmly. I'm trying to control her.
But we were told self-stimming is good. It eventually calms her.
Self-stimming?
system. It can be a way to compensate for not being held. And being held by another person is scary, but rolling or being held by surfaces produces the calming effect that ordinary children get from a hug.
How old's your child?
Well, I don't have children. No, I'm autistic. And I need the sensation of being hugged. And I've developed a machine that I get into and hugs me, and I'm different afterwards. I'm more social. Well, I didn't speak until I was 4. Now I have a BA and a master's, and I'm studying for my doctorate.
Please don't shout. Please don't shout.
Most autistic people are very sensitive to sounds and colors. Overstimulation hurts. You know, people talking too much at once, you can cause us to panic.
How did you get cured?
Well, I'm not cured. I'll always be autistic. My mother refused to believe that I wouldn't speak. And when I learned to speak, she made me go to school. And in school and at home, manners and rules were really important. They were pounded into me. I was lucky. All these things worked for me. Everyone worked hard to make sure that I was engaged. And they knew I was different, but not less. Now, I had a gift. I could see the world in a new way. I could see details that other people were blind to. My mother pushed me to become self-sufficient. I worked summers at my aunt's ranch, went to boarding school and college. Those things were uncomfortable for me at first, but they helped me to open doors to new worlds.
Excuse me, please, but we want to hear everything.
Yeah.
Are you a scientist?
Cannot get people. Think you can figure it out?
Clipboard.
Think of it as a door.
Just take one knock to the head. I don't understand why people are cruel for no
You
reason.
have a very special mind. You see the world in ways that others can't.
Mr. Raymond, this is a masterpiece.
The door opened and I went through it.
Yes, you did. And I held it.
I'm Temple Brandon.
Okay, a fragment from a brilliant film, and the title above the fragment was Knowing is Listening. Because if you, as a clinician, do not listen to people, you will not understand. Moving from the phenotype, which you can learn by listening, by observing, to the endophenotype, we need to understand, and this is what Eric Cogen of the Autism Research Center in San Diego emphasizes. Symptoms need to be understood as adaptations to underlying endophenotypic problems. So we have the endophenotype, and it moves along, and it it's what goes on behind the mask, so to say. So we have to understand that what we see has been caused by something else. For example, stereotype behavior may be there to restrict overstimulation caused by inefficient signal processing. And restricted social reciprocity may be there because of limited innate social salient attribution. And this means that the coping mechanisms of people with autism and people with psychopathology in general go their own way. So it's like a rail track which can move to different directions. You never know which direction it goes at forehand. So it is pointless to reduce a problem from one cause to one effect. It is much more complicated than that. So at the endophenotypical level, we understand that there are neuropsychological factors which play a role, like processing speed and attention, and also psychophysiology, which basically means that the formation of the brain is apparently different, alternative in children which later manifest autistic symptoms than children which do not. And there is a continuous reciprocity between the effects and the underlying causes. So at the genotypical level, at the genotype level, and I won't go into this in detail, but basically what the idea is that there's a large effect of epigenetics, which is an emerging field at the moment. Now, epigenetics, in short, means that the hereditary material on DNA, right, this has been a drawing which indicates the DNA consists of a lot of information located on genes. I always use the metaphor of the cooking book, right, full of recipes. Now, nobody cooks a cooking book from A to Z, or some people with autism might, but you do not. You first find out who is coming for dinner, whether this person is allergic, whether this person has a favor for example, prawns or other food, and then you look into your cooking book and you see what you are going to make for a meal. It's exactly like that in us and in all biological beings, for that matter, because the environment determines what parts of the DNA are active or not active. Literally, there are codons which start and stop the replication of proteins which are generated by the DNA. So what it means is that a nasty experience can have an effect on how your genetic material is expressed. It's as literal as that. So this is an emerging field, and a lot of study has gone into what factors actually influence the starting and stopping of codons on the DNA. What are the early correlates of autism? First, there's an anatomical functional level, and we know that because we know that in children with autism there's an excess of neurons in mainly the frontal part of the brain, up to 68%, which is huge. But a number of these, a good deal of these neurons seem to be non-functional. They have not differentiated as other neurons have. So basically you have a brain with functional gaps in it. Also, there are connectivity problems in the brain of people with autism. But there's also, and there's debate about that, the innate survival level, a problem of innate survival, a problem of attunement to biological motion as a natural thing, and less attention to social stimuli. First, let's look at the anatomical functional level. There are different pathways with which information is processed in the brain, which causes compensation by making people important to reason their way through situations, whereas in people without autism, they have a sort of intuitive idea of how the situation is. That's not the case with people with autism. So that takes a lot of energy, and it makes people very tired at the end of the day. There are also limited generalization skills. For example, if you teach a child with autism how to buy a bread at a baker's, it's not evident that the child can do the same thing when having to buy some meat at the butcher's. I'm exaggerating, but that's what's called generalization. So you have to explain the whole process again. There's rapid overstimulation. Well, Temple Brendan told us a little bit about that. And there's also effective cognitive dissociation. So emotions are not immediately understood in their context. Again, people have to rely on reasoning. And again, the symptoms are results of the underlying problems. Now, what is this second level, this level of normal innate survival? I'll do a little experiment with you. And there are 3 videos which were shown to children up to from 1 day old. That's very young children. And they were put in front of these 3 video screens, and the researchers monitored to which screen the children looked most. These are normally developing children, 1 day old, so basically you assume that they're normally developing. Well, I will not embarrass you, but when I asked an audience of psychiatrists, they said, well, what do you think this is? Well, what do you think this is?
Running.
Anyone? Running? Okay, running. What do you think this is? Nothing? Random movement, this is?
Walking.
Animal? Right. Would you venture? Oh, okay, it's a chicken. So here we have a chicken, here we have a chicken, here we have the same chicken but upside down, and here we have random movement. And these children, 1 day old, were put in front of these screens, and basically the majority looks at this chicken. Although it's very unlikely that a child of 1 day old has ever seen a chicken. There might have been a delivery on a farm which was rather rapid, but that's acceptable. So we assume that child has not seen the chicken. But the amazing thing is that if you ask a baby elephant, well, you don't have to ask, you have to instruct the baby elephant to look at, you would see the same thing. Baby elephant would look at this. And same with all sorts of mammals. So it's not species specific. In general, animals, including man, is prone to look at biological movement. And that's a survival mechanism, obviously, because we attune to our biological peers to understand the world. There's a second element which I'd like to show you in this brief video, which is an experiment of the still face. It's a meeting between mother and child. Excuse the Dutch text here. We'll have to turn up the sound, please.
The way she normally does.
Hi, sweetheart.
Obviously, their connection is strong.
There's my baby.
The baby is engaged, responsive, clearly emotionally content. Then, Dr. Tronick instructs the mother to disengage by making a still face. She stays there, but doesn't respond to her baby. Mackenzie is confused at first. She's not used to Mom acting like that. Mom turns back, but keeps the still face. Mackenzie expects her to re-engage, but when she doesn't, look how the baby reacts. Even at this young age, she tries to entice Mom to interact with her. She reaches out. She smiles. She flails her hands. All strategies for getting Mom's attention. When that doesn't work, she becomes fussy, emotionally agitated. And finally, she just gives up. Dr. Tronick then asks Mom to re-engage. It takes a moment, but soon the world goes back to normal for Mackenzie. This striking dynamic happens not just with parents, but with any close caregiver, and at any age, like with 2-year-old Michael and his mother.
We'll skip Michael for time's sake, but the reason for showing you the video is that the initiative to engage also comes from the child. And it was not very long ago that we thought that children in a sort of autistic phase, all children in the autistic phase, did not do anything until they were acted upon. But it's actually the child that takes a large deal of the initiative to interact. So a child is born with the natural orientation to social or biological movement, and a child is born with the ability to initiate interaction. Now, how does this work with children with autism? Now, Ami Kling in Yale at the time did an experiment with 2-year-olds who were just diagnosed with autism. And he asked them to look at a video, and he asked them to look at this video. So this video consists of 2 moving parts. One is of a man dancing, and the other is the same man upside down. So the paradigm is that this is the most interesting thing biologically and socially. So children will look at this picture for the largest deal of time. Now, he asked children with autism to look at the videos, children which were typically developing, and children with Down syndrome. And look what happens. And if you follow the cross, you see where the children look on average. There we go.
Johnny, hey Johnny,
Look, it's Teddy. Do you want to play with Teddy? Teddy wants to play with you. Hi, Teddy. How are you doing? Yeah, Teddy. Johnny, look. Teddy, can you say hi to Teddy? Teddy needs a hug. Give Teddy a hug. Teddy, you want a hug? Teddy wants a hug. Teddy. Hi, Teddy.
Right. Now he did the same thing for the same thing, but with a different background music. He thought, well, it's boring, this man talking about Teddy and a hug and stuff like that. So he said, well, we'll add a song, Patty Cake. Now look what happens. Look what happens in the beginning with the child with autism and after the music starts. There we go. Sorry, it's a little bit different. The sound is a little bit difficult, so we'll have to. Thanks very much. It's good now, but there's a little hum on it. Let me find the mouse. Here we go. Right. So second experiment, different music.
Johnny. Hey, Johnny. Hey, can you see me? Hi. Let's play a game. Let's play patty cake. Ready? Patty cake. Patty cake. Baker's man. Bake me a cake as fast as you can. Roll it and pat it and mark it with the B. Make me a cake for baby and me. Woohoo!
Okay.
Yeah, baby.
Right. So, what do you notice? Yeah, exactly. So in the first video, children with autism look at left and right picture 50% of the time. That's the box, the large box. 50% of the time left, 50% of the time right. So in the paradigm, they do not have the preference of biological movement. In the second video, you see that the cross suddenly moves to the other side as soon as the song starts. Does that mean that the child is suddenly interested in biological movement? No, it does not. It means that in this second video, there's a physical contingency. In other words, there is a contingency between the movement of two dots, like that, patty cake, and that is what interests the child with autism. It's a predictable physical contingency. It's a pattern. Children with autism look for patterns. They couldn't care less whether that is a man or a steam engine. There's a physical contingency. So what you see in the second video and in the first video is that children with autism are not inclined to focus on biological movement, are not inclined to focus on peers, but they are inclined to look at physical contingencies. And it's the same with adults with autism. In socially salient scenes, for example, these are stills from the film Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. You see, for example, that people without autism focus on the eyes of this man, on the actor, whereas people with autism focus generally on the hair here, for example. So, and even afterwards, they will not be able to explain the social salience of that scene. We are running, I have to look at my team. We are running slightly out of time. Do I have 10 more minutes? Yes. Okay. I would like to show you autism, and then we move on to attachment, I promise you. I'd like to show you autism in adults. It's a Dutch film made by the Dutch Society for the Dutch Autistic Society. It's in Dutch, but it's got English subtitles. And it's about couples where one
zien twee portretstellen waarvan de een een vorm van autisme heeft en de ander niet. Roland heeft sinds 5 jaar de diagnose Asperger en heeft 4 jaar een relatie met Sandra. Sandra wist dus bij de start van hun relatie dat Roland Asperger heeft. Ze wonen apart, maar wel in dezelfde straat. Roland is uitvinder en kan snel oplossingen bedenken voor ingewikkelde problemen. Petra en Eduard kennen elkaar van dansles en zijn nu 20 jaar samen. Bij Petra is de diagnose Asperger 2 jaar geleden gesteld. Ze hebben 3 kinderen. Petra is verkoopstyliste en begeleider op een basisschool.
Sorry, ik ben zo terug. Met Sandra. Ik Ik kies bewust voor een partner en het feit dat hij autistisch is geen belemmering voor mij geweest. Het is wel heel belangrijk dat je er kunt ontdekken van jezelf dat je in staat bent om ermee om te gaan. Dag liefje, doeg.
Die diagnose is eigenlijk een zegen voor ons huwelijk. Want wij weten nu concreet wat tussen het probleem is en waar we dus aan moeten werken.
Omdat Sandra zo'n sterke persoonlijkheid is, gaat het allemaal heel goed. Want bij andere relaties, als een vrouw een beetje aan zichzelf twijfelt ergens in, omdat ik bijvoorbeeld niet liefdevol genoeg ben of zo, en dan gaat die relatie stuk, zeg maar.
Er is ook een duidelijk voordeel en dat is dat het je heel veel vrijheid en ruimte oplevert om ook je leven te leven zoals jij het graag wil leven.
Volgens mij heb ik niet van dat soort gevoelens als verliefdheid of houden van. Nee, dat herken ik niet bij mezelf. En of misschien onderschat ik het omdat ik dan van die verhalen hoor van anderen, van hoe geweldig het is. En ik heb die gevoelens niet bij mezelf. Ik heb een vriendin gehad die zei, je houdt toch wel van me? Ja, kan ik niet zo zeggen. Lastig hoor.
Dat was in het begin wel even wennen. Iemand die niet kan zeggen dat hij van je houdt. En als hij het een enkele keer wel zegt van ik hou van je, dan trekt hij dat ook eigenlijk binnen een uur weer terug. Want het is voor hem dan ook altijd maar een momentopname. Inmiddels weet ik dat houden van, dat daar geen gevoel achter zit bij Roland. Dus dat het ook eigenlijk niet echt iets betekent.
Ik ben heel eerlijk in.
Okay, we'll stop the film because the subtitles are not very clear, so because not everybody speaks Dutch. I will stop it here, but basically I'll send you the link if you like with the PDF, but then you have to learn Dutch. What the film deals about is couples of which one person has autism and how they cope. Basically it's very interesting, but it's not very sensible to proceed if not everybody can read. Now we move on to attachment. Okay, so we've dealt with autism, we dealt with the innate problems with autism, and how does this correlate with attachment? Well, attachment, I do not need to explain much to you about attachment, of course, but Bowlby already said babies are destined to take part in social interaction. We've seen proof of that. Insecurity leads to protest, despair, and detachment. And the aim is not so much the relationship with the mother, but to achieve a physical state, Bowlby said. Attachment has a biological base. Now, attachment was seen as affect regulation, and it was the relationship, the degree of attachment was seen as the cumulative result of experience of the child in its first year of life. That's what Ainsworth said. Now, attachment can be seen as a determinant of interpersonal relationship, because secure attachment as a child leads to later on more resilience, more social orientation, more empathy, more self-respect. And there are links between how a child is attached and how the child as an adult later on will relate to his environment, his or her environment. And a lot of research has been done on that. There's a determining factor in the process is whether the child, by the adult, by the parent, is seen as an intentional being. In other words, does the parent or the caregiver, is it possible for the caregiver to think my child has feelings, expectations and thoughts? If that's the case, then there is a precondition for establishing a secure attachment. And abuse early on does explain a lot of insecure attachment, but not everything. Now, in looking at resistant and ambivalent attachment, a meta-analysis was done with 2,000 mother-child pairs, and 14% have an average income and 24 low-income group. And the risk appeared to be abuse and neglect, indeed, but also the fact that the mother was depressed or that there was unresolved grief or abuse. And the children were less competent in conflict management. Now, attachment has to do with social bonding, and social bonding also has biological correlates, and I was enthusiastic to see that there's later on a presentation on oxytocin, because many animals, not being able to reason very much, determine the degree of bonding by recognition, and recognition is in essence, smell. So animals smell familiarity, so to say. And that is modulated by oxytocin and vasopressin. Those are two chemical substances. So it's as if the bonding relationship becomes a sort of marker for who it is, the identity of the relationship between two individuals. And we know that early stress has a negative effect on the stress, the degree we deal with stress, and also on the immune response. And this whole oxytocin and vasopressin is too detailed to go, and besides there is a presentation later on, but it is moderated by the bulbus olfactorius, which is a small knob somewhere in the brain near to the nose, the end of the nose, and all the neurons that project it. Now, bonding is seen to be the task of oxytocin, whereas rejection has been said to be modulated by vasopressin. Now, it's not so simple as that. The reality is more complicated, because it appears that oxytocin enhances contact with trusted persons, at least for some degree of time, but it also prevents contact with others. In other words, it makes the person exclusive. It enhances the exclusiveness of one person. So the reason why I'm mentioning oxytocin is because there are experiments to look at oxytocin in autism, and oxytocin spray to make children with autism more social. There might be an adverse effect, because it might be that they become more social towards the important other, but less social towards others. There are still experiments going on, and it is a hot topic. Attachment and autism. Right now we try to combine both. There have been some studies conducted on autism and attachment, and for example Rutgers did a meta-analytic review, 10 studies, and he found that there were fewer secure attachments than in other children with autism, and the attachment of security correlated to the degree of autism and the IQ. In other words, higher IQ, better attachment. That was what that study concluded. Now, children with autism distinguish between parents and others and react similarly to parent leaving in the strange situation experiment. Another paper on autism and attachment indicated that secure attachment is established later on, so it's delayed. There's an association between attachment and age. And, as we mentioned before, there were fewer attachment problems in children with higher IQ range, and adults with autism are in the majority securely attached. A study conducted by Taylor. Now, van IJzendoorn in 2007, who did a lot of research on attachment and also on attachment with autism, studied 55 toddlers with autism, mental retardation, language delay, and typically developing children, and parents. And he found, or their group found, that parents with children with autism were equally sensitive as parents with children without autism. So if you look at the parent factor, there didn't appear to be much difference. But the autism children, the children with autism, showed more attachment disorganization and less child involvement. There were more sensitive parents, had more secure children, but only in the group without autism. And there were less autism symptoms predicted, more secure attachment. So if you put this in a model, and this is a hypothetical model, you could say, well, the aim of attachment is learning. It's like learning to understand the world. And the child factor is a biological orientation towards the environment. And the mother, could equally be the father, offers safety and responsiveness to the initiatives taken by the child. And the result is a natural exploration, right? This is a model. So, what is the contributing factor of autism? Well, when the child or the parent forms a risk for secure attachment. So if the child has autism, it's not socially oriented, so this process is interrupted. And if the mother has autism, and that's a field that has not been studied, we're working on a protocol now to look at parenting with autism. If the mother has autism, then there's also a hiccup in the system because the responsiveness to the environment is less. What about insecure attachment as a sort of disturbing factor in this model? Well, when the parent is not safely attached, you can imagine that the responsiveness is also less. So there are different ways in which autism and attachment can interact. And I would now, I'm going grossly over time, but we did start a bit late. It's a feeble excuse. Martine, this film, and then I'll wind up. Okay?
Extra. Come on. Well, I'm going to ask you to do one.
Don't slap me.
I'm not going to smack you. Just want you to get dressed.
I don't want to.
Well, you have to go to school in the pyjamas, that's it then.
No!
Well, come on, we're going to be late.
Shush!
Why does anybody have a child? Why? It's just bloody hard work. I suppose if you've got the love there, it isn't hard work, but to me, all it was just bloody hard work, inconvenience, mess, noise, expense, curtailment of our social life, of our enjoyment, our freedom. For what? Can you go off the table, please? You pick that up, please. Every single thing, from the moment her eyes are open in the morning to the moment she goes to bed, everything is a fight.
I want to go downstairs!
No, I'm going to bed now.
Please!
See you in the morning.
No!
Fred en Diane wonen in het Oost-Engelse Essex. Fred werkte vroeger als radiotechnicus bij de Royal Air Force. Nu maakt hij trouwvideo's. Diane is ambtenaar bij de Belastingdienst. Hun dochter Georgina is 7. Als peuter was ze al onhandelbaar. Fred legde de betere en de ergste momenten van haar ontwikkeling vast. Ze is uit haar eerste kinderdagverblijf gezet toen ze 2,5 was.
When a nursery says that your child is acting not on a par with other children in terms of defiance and strength, throwing things across the room and kicking out, that is when the warning bells started, and it's just steadily got worse.
5 peuterklasjes en 6 kinderoppassen later zochten haar ouders een medische verklaring voor haar gedrag.
We've had brain scans done, blood tests, she's had a psychiatric assessment, she's been to various behavioural therapists.
Er kwam niets bijzonders aan het licht. Fred en Diane voelen zich steeds meer geïsoleerd.
You have your child line, your children in need. You had your crisis for crying babies. Whenever we've called anybody, what have we got? Absolutely nothing. And then they've got the flaming nerve to say, you were witness smacking your child. I just want it removed. I can't say killed, because no one can kill someone. We had a chance to kill it when it was a fetus. We had a good chance. And don't you think we say that time and time again?
We find it very difficult to be warm and loving towards a child who tends to want to destroy them.
In november 2002 was voor Fred en Diane de maand vol.
I rang social services and said, well look, something's got to happen. It's either, I'm going to get a heart attack and the kid will be without a dad, or she'll have to go into care.
At that moment, that was the solution. Out of face, out of mind, out of space, freedom. If it is us, several people have said the problem is with us, then why have so many other adults not been able to manage her?
Vroeger heeft Georgina het geneesmiddel Ritalin gekregen om te proberen haar gedrag onder controle te houden. Nu is ze officieel erkend als een kind met speciale noden. Maar Warwick is ervan overtuigd dat als de ouders erop vooruit gaan, het kind zal volgen.
We're prepared to accept that maybe, we are not the best of parents and that we need guidance as well. But having said that, I also believe that there is still something not physically right with Georgina and her brain.
Time of life, I'm determined. I didn't want to know. And then, of course, we had a premature baby, didn't we, at 32 weeks. Special care baby unit. That's the root of all my problems, because I've been used to working with computers or paper and files, and I was in control. Push this button, that's what's going to happen. With the baby, it was, oh, what does that noise mean? What do I do now? How do I pick it up? We felt as if we were doing it all wrong. It wasn't our baby, it was a blob in a box. And I would say the worst night of my life was the first night where I was in a room in hospital with her and they disconnected all the machines and the bleepers. And I went, oh my God, I don't want to go to sleep because supposing she stops breathing. I was helpless. And then when we brought her home, if I didn't get it right first time, I thought, oh, I've fed you, I've changed you, I've done what I should. You're crying. Get on with it. You cry. I don't know what to do. Because Fred raised 2 children from a young age by himself, I would turn to him and he'd assume control. Perhaps if Fred hadn't been around, I'd have had to do these things and they would have come natural. But they didn't come natural.
Denkend aan de woorden van Warwick kijken Fred en Diane terug naar Georgina toen ze 4 was.
The child is obviously in distress, crying out for attention and affection. And I am stonewalling her. If it wasn't me in that film, I'd be reporting the mother to social services. You want to go into the tape recorder now and cuddle her, don't you? But at the time, it's that whole life, go away, we don't want you. I've seen that bit until you pointed it out. But it says it all. It's only a few seconds, but I think it's very, very powerful. I feel if that was another person and not me, I'd go into that set and shake that person.
Does it make you feel guilty then?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Later op de dag keek Georgina ook naar de videofilm.
To hear it coming out of her own mouth as she watched herself. Mummy, I was having a tantrum there. I was crying. And you laughed at me. You should have cuddled me. And she's not even 8, and she's saying that to me now. It shows that we've actually...
Profound.
Very profound. We've had on our hands a very intelligent child, which perhaps is the problem. Although the label, one label given to her was learning difficulties, but
yes,
I think not.
Okay. Well, I still find this video very impressive, even after all the number of times that I've seen it. The reason why I'm showing it is first of all I must emphasize I do not know Fred, I do not know Diana, I do not know the child, Georgina. So what I'm suggesting is purely based on this fragment. Okay, so I'm not saying these people have autism or ADHD or attachment problems. I do not know them. But based on this fragment, for the sake of the presentation which you've just seen, as a clinician I would say I see elements of autism in a mother who is used to dealing with machines, norms, predictability, and who is evidently clumsy when taking a child out taking a child out of the bath, for example. So I would certainly be alert to whether there are autistic symptoms. I see a child which shows disruptive behavior, which could be ADHD, but it could be many other things. So you can't see it on the outside, certainly not in this fragment. And I see a husband who is also, who raises my clinical interest, because why does a father say, when Georgina as a child just said, you should have picked me up, you should have helped me, say, oh, that's very profound. It's not profound at all. It's extremely normal what the child said. So in this fragment it shows that if you deal with people with problems and you do not take into regard the context, you miss an awful lot. Right, moving on to the last slide. Attachment at risk. So the number of risk factors for establishing a secure attachment in the child, and there's a number of risk factors in the parent, and it can lead to biological dysregulation, anxiety, growth retardation, personality problems, behavior problems, etc. The reciprocity between attachment and autism goes both ways. So the proneness for autism here and the proneness for attachment problems there interact, and in this process genes are involved and environment is involved. So if you have the hope to come out into this lecture room with some more clarity, I must disappoint you, because it's all vastly more complicated than we originally thought. Conclusions. Autism is at risk, is a risk for developing secure attachment. Also, insecure attachment is a risk for autism becoming manifest. Children with autism can be securely attached, contrary to what we believed a few years ago. Both attachment and autism concern early regulation of affect and have a pervasive influence on further development. There are conceptual challenges on autism, ADHD, attachment, which you must deal with, and more research is necessary to understand the relationship between autism and attachment. And having exceeded my time scandalously, I thank you very much for your attention.